Welcome to Her Story, the history of Southeast Asia told from her perspective. We'll discover historical figures, matriarchal societies, and contemporary female icons, and maybe learn about ourselves along the way. I'm your host, Agas Ramirez. In this episode, we're going to talk about Henerala Salud Algabre, a prominent member of the Sakdalista movement, a Filipino peasant organization founded in 1930 to oppose American colonialism and the ruling elites in the Philippines.
Magtanim ay di biro, maghapon ang kayupo, di naman makatayo, di naman makaupo. Sa umaga kagising ay agad iisipin, kung saan may patanim, masarap na pagkain. Pinsik ko'y namamanhid, tanong ko'y nakakawin, binti ko'y namimintit sa pagkababad sa tubig.
There's a poem about Salud Algabre by E. San Juan Jr. that starts like this. Anong kapangahasan, apoy ng kababaihan, biruing ibulalas, walang sayang, hoy! Bawat siklab ng pagbabalikwas ay pagsulong sa wastong direksyon. What audacity, this fire in women! She dares to say, nothing is wasted. Each spark of rebellion is progress in the right direction. Salud Algabre is a curious figure in Philippine history, and it's no surprise that Isan Juan Jr. made continuous references to her in his collection of poems. Now, many of you, even Filipinos, are probably thinking, who's Salud Algabre? How come I've never heard of her? Well, that's because she isn't referenced much in textbooks and popular culture. No movies or songs or podcast episodes until now. I was being a bit cheeky with the title, Ang Henerala, after that Gerald Tarog movie. You know the one. Hey, he's made two very popular films about generals after all. She could be next, just saying. As Luisa T. Camagay, our main source for this episode, writes, quote, in books containing short biographies of Filipinos in history, there are few women, and Salud doesn't figure in the list. There's more documentation of Filipino women who struggled to be given the right to vote. The fact that this was a cause spearheaded by educated and professional women who were able to document their struggle made them by default visible in the historical narrative. Absent or rare, however, is the documentation of women who were active in the nationalist movement but came from the lower class. Legitimate though the causes of both these types of women, struggles by peasant women remain absent or marginalized in the pages of the nation's history. Unquote. Camagay goes on to say that even the Sakdal movement itself isn't well known today, even though it was part of a long history of peasant movements that combined nationalism with a struggle for land. Let's talk about the political climate and the Sakdal movement a little bit here, just so we understand what was going on. An article from the Philippine Collegian by Nicolas Basilio Antonio was especially helpful here as this topic can be dense. In the 1930s, the Philippines was grappling with the transition from Spanish to American colonial rule, marked by political compromises and economic structures favoring U.S. interests. Manuel Luis Molina Quezon, or MLQ, assumed the presidency of the Philippine Commonwealth on November 15, 1935. MLQ's famous quote is, better a country ran like hell by Filipinos than one ran like heaven by the Americans. And ran like hell it was, writes Antonio in the Philippine Collegian. Political machinations and vested business interests characterized and compromised the Quezon administration's independence movement. Unquote. The Philippine economy back then was basically set up to serve American interests. And guess who was happy to play along? The country's powerful elite who had control over both the land and politics. Huge estates or haciendas focused on growing cash crops like sugar and tobacco to ship off to the U.S. Meanwhile, the actual work of farming was done by countless peasants, many of whom were trapped in this system. They spent their whole lives working the same land, knowing they'd never get a chance to own it.
Planting rice is never fun. Then from morn till the set of sun, cannot stand and cannot sit, cannot rest for a little bit. Planting rice is no fun. Then from morn till the set of sun, cannot stand and cannot sit, cannot rest for a little bit. Planting rice is no fun.
Naturally, some people very rightly had a problem with this. Agrarian unrest has been part of Philippine history for a long time. By the 19th century, land wasn't just about growing food anymore. It became a valuable economic asset because of the booming demand for cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and hemp. When the Spanish opened the country to global trade, landowners, whether they were religious orders or wealthy individuals, started growing these profitable crops. Most Filipino farmers only had a small plot of land, about 2 to 3 hectares, and often had to borrow money at crazy interest rates just to keep things running. If they couldn't pay back the loan, they lost their land. Over time, a handful of rich landowners ended up controlling most of the land, and tenant farming became the norm. Things didn't improve under American rule. Many farmers didn't have formal titles to their land because the process to get one was expensive, time consuming, and complicated. By the early 20th century, Filipino society was still dominated by big landowners, and the gap between them and the average farmer kept growing. Then came the Great Depression in the 1930s, which made life even harder for farmers. This economic crisis added fuel to the fire, sparking several peasant uprisings, including the rise of the Sakdal movement. But unlike the usual spur of the moment revolts, Sakdal was also a nationalist group. The founder of the Sakdal movement, Benigno Ramos, had once worked for the Philippine Senate under Manuel Quezon, but later became one of Quezon's biggest critics. In 1930, Ramos started the Sakdal newspaper and organization. Sakdal means to accuse or to strike in Tagalog, and the group's goal was to call out government officials for their failures, especially when it came to helping ordinary people. Sakdal isn't a commonly used word today, but I still hear it in Tagalog news reports, as in nasasakdal sa salang pagpatay or accused of murder. Ramos was allegedly inspired by the J'accuse editorial of the French novelist Émile Zola. The Sakdalistas seem to draw inspiration from Gandhi's non cooperation movement in India. They urged non-violent resistance, which meant don't vote and don't pay the poll tax. The Sakdal newspaper, in one of its early issues, argued that independence wasn't something to politely ask for. It was a right Filipinos should declare and claim for themselves. I think we can all agree with that. Ramos put it bluntly: the Americans have promised us independence before, but they've always backed out. This new law is just a way to keep us quiet for another 10 years. The Sakdalistas believed that real independence could only be achieved by Filipinos on their own terms. This growing discontent with the agrarian system and colonial control drew a lot of people to join the movement. Among them was a seamstress named Salud Algabre. Salud Algabre was born in 1894, 2 years before Philippine independence from Spain. Quintana and David write that according to municipal records, the exact date is October 6. However, in an interview with Dr. Isagani R. Medina in 1977, Salud said she doesn't actually know her birthday. Quote, at that time, people didn't pay attention to dates. They reckoned time by the seasons, such as the ripening of the corn and the flowering of the mangoes. She was the daughter of Maximo Algabre, a landowner from Cabuyao, and Justina Terones, a seamstress. Her paternal grandfather had a lot of land and 5 granaries. This qualified him for public office, and he was gobernadorcillo during the Spanish period. He would later lose all of this, but it's not clear how. Her parents had some education, They studied in Manila for about 6 years before going back to Cabuyao, where they raised their family. They had 9 children, but only 6 would survive to adulthood. In 1903, Salud was sent to live with her uncle in Tondo, Manila, while she went to school. But by fourth grade, her mother became scared that she would be taken to America by her music teacher, a Mrs. Brown. She was sent back to Laguna, where she was homeschooled. In 1913, so when she was 19 years old, she participated in an annual parade of the town's beauties. She was said to be very attractive and had many suitors, one of whom was Severo Generalia. He was the son of a baker and had an associate arts degree from Liceo de Manila. They married in 1915 and moved to Manila, where Salud was working as a seamstress like her mother. She used to do buttonholes by hand for an exporter of baby dresses. Incidentally, I just learned to do buttonholes. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I'm studying sewing right now, so this was fun to learn. She also had a number of other jobs. She and her sister used to iron clothes. She also sold mami, which is a Chinese noodle dish, and took care of horses. She even worked as a supervisor in the sand and gravel trade. Severo, her husband, was working at a tobacco factory where he was the union president. One thing led to another, as it so often does when you're a union member, and they needed to move back to their hometown to avoid trouble. So, from educated laborers, they became landless peasants. They had a stall in a public market and went into farming. This is when the couple got to know the ins and outs of the agrarian issues and became acquainted with the Sakdalista movement. In Salud's own words, when we worked the land, we were cheated. The terms on the estate were 50-50. If the tenants harvested 1,000 tons, 500 were to go to the proprietario or landowner, and 500 to the farmers. But we never got the agreed 50%. We would get a mere 25%, sometimes even less. Unquote. In 1930, so now she's 36 years old, her grandfather, Lolo Nino, hands her a newspaper. He said, "Here, Salud, since this is how you feel, with your intense love for your country, here's something about revolution. Here, read it." And read it she did. The newspaper, Sakdal, talked about the plight of peasants like her. She also learned about the movement's goals. What they wanted was very simple: the redistribution of land and the independence of the Philippines from the United States. Given their background and their education and their personal beliefs, it's easy to see how Salud and Severo would be inclined to join the Sakdalistas. In fact, they helped organize the movement in their town. They believed in Benigno Ramos and what the movement stood for. They distributed free copies of the newspaper Sakdal. According again to Quintanaren David, she would buy 50 to 100 copies of the paper and give them away for free. At the time, each copy cost about 2 cents each. She also explained its contents to other peasants, many of whom would not have been able to read. Naturally, they became prominent members of Sakdal, and the members would often meet at Salud's house. They came from nearby provinces such as Tayabas, Batangas, Cavite, Rizal, and Bulacan. In the morning, they would hold Mass. Gregorio Aglipay, the head of the Philippine Independent Church himself, would officiate. Aglipay was excommunicated from the Catholic Church in 1902 and started a church where all the clergy were Filipino. And then, for the rest of the day, they would talk politics. And so it went for a couple more years until something changed. By 1933, Sakdal had evolved into a political party. They held a convention, drafted a constitution, and laid out their principles. When the Tydings-McDuffie law was passed in 1934, promising Philippine independence after a 10-year transition period, Benigno Ramos wasn't buying it. He believed it was just another empty promise from the U.S. meant to stall the independence movement. Fast forward to May 1935. A plebiscite was set to ratify the new constitution. By this time, the Sakdal movement had spread across multiple provinces, especially those with large estates and tenant farmers. The group's demands were still very clear: land reform, breaking up the big haciendas, and immediate unconditional independence from the United States. By that time, authorities were paying very close attention to the Sakdalistas. Many of them were arrested for not paying taxes. Salud's husband was among those arrested at one point. Things came to a head in April when, during a meeting in Salud's house, they decided it was time to strike back. Salud informed the members of the nearby towns of Cabuyao, such as San Pedro, Calamba, Los Baños, and Caluan, of what they were going to do. They would occupy the municipal hall, raise the Sakdal flag, and proclaim independence themselves. So now it's the afternoon of May 2, 1935. The air in Cabuyao, Laguna is heavy with tension. Peasants and farmers, armed with bolos, clubs, sickles, and a few shotguns, gather near the railroad station. Among them is a striking figure, a woman dressed in a white, long-sleeved shirt, a red skirt, and a blue tapis, with a white headband wrapped around her forehead. The colors were intentional. This was the Philippine flag. Salud Algabre, seamstress, peasant farmer, and agrarian reform activist, was about to lead her fellow Sakdalistas in a bold attempt to demand immediate independence from American rule. Their plan? To disrupt the plebiscite scheduled for later that month, which sought to ratify a constitution under the Tydings-McDuffie Act. For Salud and the Sakdalistas, a 10-year transition period under American oversight wasn't good enough. They wanted immediate, complete, and absolute independence. No waiting, no compromises. On the afternoon of May 2, the uprising began. The Sakdalistas blocked railroads, cut telegraph lines, and patrolled the national highway. Traffic was halted. Salud herself led the group that blocked the road, stopping cars and demanding weapons from those inside. One memorable encounter involved a group of American Marines. When a sergeant asked why they were being stopped, Salud, calm and composed, introduced herself and her companions as Sakdalistas. She explained their demand for independence and even issued receipts for the firearms they confiscated. One eyewitness described her along these lines. Quote, Salud Algabre, the Henerala, was a thin, slight woman, but her frailty ended there. In her attire, her brisk manner, and her speed, she affected a martial disposition. She was the perfect picture of a war general. Side note, Salud's husband's name was Henerala, double L, but she didn't take his name, and she was known as Henerala in her own right. During the uprising, and despite the tension, Salud ensured that the Marines were fed and taken care of before releasing them the next morning. The Sakdals took hold of the municipal hall for over 24 hours. They removed the American flag and replaced it with the red flag of the Sakdals. Salud said that there was no previous preparation for the siege. When the people were in the municipal hall, that was when I started going around asking and getting food from stores from different houses. By the next day, so May 3, Governor Juan Cailles, a former revolutionary general now aligned with the Commonwealth government, led a force of the Philippine Constabulary soldiers to storm the municipal hall in Cabuyao. This attack ended the uprising, which only lasted for 2 days. When the constabulary arrived, Salud wasn't there. She had gone home briefly to get more food. But when she heard that the constabulary was after her, she fled to a friend's house to check on her children before hiding in an irrigation canal. I submerged myself in the water, she later recounted, keeping my head under as long as I could stand it without breathing, then rising for air. At one point during her escape, Salud encountered a soldier armed with a rifle and a fixed bayonet. He ordered her to approach. Standing tall and composed, she walked up to him. They stared at each other in silence until, after what seemed like an eternity, the soldier lowered his rifle and walked away. Perhaps he believed I had an anting-anting, Salud later reflected, referring to the amulets believed to grant protection. But my only anting-anting was help from God. Her escape was harrowing. She crossed rivers, trekked through rice paddies, and even endured aerial searches. At one point, her long hair got tangled in the branch of a tree, saving her from falling into a river. She survived by eating raw eggs she found in a hen's nest and navigating the darkness illuminated only by the flickering light of fireflies. Eventually, Salud was discovered by her uncle, a fellow Sakdalista, who convinced her to surrender. Convinced is one way to put it. The constabulary was threatening to burn down all the houses, so she was presented to the authorities in Silang Cavite and later brought to Santa Cruz, Laguna, before being transferred to Manila for trial. Severo, her husband, managed to evade capture for 7 months by hiding in Mount Makiling, but was also eventually arrested. She was in jail from May 5 to October 1, 1935, when she was released on bail. While in jail, some American officials interviewed her about why she did what she did. She told them the Sakdalistas were after immediate, complete, and absolute independence. Salud's trial dragged on for nearly 4 years, during which her children accompanied her to court. In January 1939, she was found guilty of being part of an illegal association and sentenced to 6 to 10 years in prison, along with a fine of 5,000 pesos. She was the only woman Sakdalista who was imprisoned for the Cabuyao uprising. However, she only served a year and 7 months before being pardoned by President Quezon, the very leader the Sakdalistas had risen against. I have no idea if their views about him changed after that. Sakdalistas referred to Quezon as Dugong Castilla, a Spanish colonizer by blood. The Sakdal uprising may not have achieved its immediate goal, but Salud Algabre never considered it a failure. In her words, no uprising fails. Each one is a step toward the right direction. There's a lot to be said for the Sakdalistas. Salud once told an interviewer that the writer Amado V. Hernandez called them samahang walang kadala-dala. In English, the movement that cannot be intimidated. But in Tagalog, there's a bit of sarcasm there, maybe? I say this because somebody who is not nadadala does the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. In my experience, when someone tells you, wala kang kadala-dala, it's not usually a compliment. Salud's story continues into the Second World War, so it's also serendipitous that we're ending this season with her story. In Season 3, we will be diving headfirst into Japan's quest for the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Benigna Ramos and other Sakdalistas became members of the Makapili, Association of Patriotic Filipinos, for which they were accused of collusion with the Japanese. So yes, we will be talking about the complex relationship of nationalist movements with Japan, not just in the Philippines, but the rest of Southeast Asia. Salud herself denies that the Sakdals were in league with the Japanese. Salud Algabre survived the Second World War and would live to the age of 85. Here's a final interesting fact about her. She passed away on May 2, 1979, the exact day of the 44th anniversary of the uprising that changed her life forever. But the story doesn't end here, not by a long shot. Her legacy is alive and well in anybody who believes in independence and a better future for those who need and deserve it the most. This includes her descendants, who keep her memory close to their hearts. In the second part of this episode, we sit down with Ana Algabre Hernandez, poet, painter, book author, writer, and granddaughter of Henerala Salud. See you in a few. Thank you for listening to episode 30, Ang Henerala Salud Algabre. Like I said, do not go anywhere because we have a very important interview coming up. Shout out to our patrons, Shereen, Geraineon, Xiaomei by Milish, Jennifer, Christina, Raymond, Matt, Ashley, Chanda, Yati, and our newest member, Christopher. Head on over to Patreon right now to listen to 9 bonus episodes. I'm working on a 10th. Along with those bonus episodes, you get access to full scripts and reference materials, and you can also send me a message if you have comments or questions. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Threads, and Instagram at Her Story Pod. That's Her Story, SEA Pod. This podcast was hosted and edited by Agus Ramirez. Maraming salamat!